In this video, we're going to be talking about a major Supreme Court emergency election and redistricting dispute that is now developing out of Virginia. At the same time, the Supreme Court also just issued a major order in the Alabama redistricting case. All of this will likely reshape the upcoming elections nationwide, but also how things will look for the foreseeable future. So let's break down what is now happening. Now, before we jump into this video, if you want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply by subscribing. You can also hit the like button. That just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this type of content, and so it shares it with more people. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we're going to be discussing a huge election and constitutional law dispute that is now quickly developing in front of the Supreme Court. The main case that we're going to be discussing involves a challenge to Virginia's new congressional redistricting amendment and whether the Virginia Supreme Court improperly struck down that amendment. But before we talk about this new emergency filing in the Virginia case, we need to briefly discuss what is also happening nationally, because there are now multiple major redistricting and election disputes all colliding at the same time. Now, just this week on Monday, the Supreme Court issued a major order. It was a 6-3 order in a series of Alabama redistricting cases tied to an earlier Allen versus Milligan litigation. So this case, it's playing off of some of that. Now, many of you probably remember that originally in the Allen versus Milligan case, I believe now its main title is Allen versus Castor, but essentially the original case from 2023, where there was the Supreme Court ruling upholding the lower court's rulings, finding that Alabama's congressional districts likely violated Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Now, following that ruling by the Supreme Court, Alabama then adopted a new congressional map, and that happened in 2023. The map was challenged again in federal courts, and the lower courts again ruled against the state of Alabama. However, this week when the case got back in front of the Supreme Court issued an order and vacated those lower court rulings and sent the cases back down for reconsideration in light of the Supreme Court's newer decision in a case called Louisiana versus Calais. Now, procedurally, that is very significant because it shows how the Supreme Court may be recalibrating how Voting Rights Act and redistricting claims are analyzed moving forward. There was also a dissent in that order that was issued this Monday, and that came from Justice Sotomayor, who was joined by Kagan and Jackson, so the liberal bloc of justices joined in the dissent. So right now, there are major disputes developing nationally over redistricting, the Voting Rights Act and these claims, the election administrations, and the role that courts should play in all of these types of cases. And now the Virginia case has entered the picture in a very major way and is in front of the Supreme Court. The Virginia case involves a proposed constitutional amendment tied to congressional redistricting. Virginia lawmakers passed a constitutional amendment that would allow the General Assembly to redraw congressional districts outside of the normal census cycle under certain circumstances. The amendment then went through Virginia's constitutional amendment process and was ultimately approved by the voters in April of 2026. The new congressional maps associated with the amendment reportedly would have favored Democrats in 10 of Virginia's 11 congressional districts. However, Republican lawmakers challenged the amendment process in court before the referendum even occurred. And last week, by a 4-3 vote, the Virginia Supreme Court ruled against the amendment process and invalidated that referendum. Now, importantly, the Virginia Supreme Court said that this was fundamentally a procedural constitutional issue. The court concluded that the General Assembly did not properly comply with Virginia's constitutional requirement involving the next general election before passing the amendment a second time. And this is where the dispute becomes very technical. The entire case largely revolves around the meaning of the term general election. The Virginia Supreme Court essentially concluded that early voting was part of the general election itself. Because of that interpretation, the court held that the constitutional amendment process violated Virginia's constitutional timing requirements for this type of change. And because of that, the Virginia Supreme Court invalidated the amendment in a 4-3 vote. The court then ordered that Virginia continue using the earlier congressional maps that had previously been imposed by the court. And because of that, now this case is rapidly moving forward and it's now heading to the United States Supreme Court. Virginia Democrats and Virginia, the Attorney General Jay Jones, have now essentially filed an emergency application asking for the Supreme Court to intervene in this case. In that filing, they argue that the Virginia Supreme Court's ruling was deeply mistaken on two critical issues of federal law, with profound practical importance to the nation. The applicants argue that the Virginia Supreme Court improperly interpreted federal election laws and improperly expanded the meaning of the term election. Specifically, they argue that the federal law establishes a single election day for congressional elections and that the early voting occurs before the election rather than becoming part of the election itself. The applicants here, or the state of Virginia, is essentially arguing here that the Virginia Supreme Court departed too far from the text of the Virginia Constitution itself. But on the other side, of course, the Republicans are arguing that the Supreme Court in Virginia got this correct and that the Supreme Court should affirm that ruling by the Virginia Supreme Court. Now, in this case, we already have movement in the United States Supreme Court. You had Chief Justice Roberts, who's in charge of this area. He essentially instructed the challengers to file a response to the emergency application by 5 p.m. on May 14th. So procedurally, the Supreme Court is now actively considering this emergency dispute and deciding if they want to get involved on an emergency basis. After the response is filed, the Supreme Court could deny relief, issue a temporary administrative stay, grant emergency relief, or potentially take additional action depending on how the justices view this type of issue. Now, this case is important for a couple of reasons. First, it's another example of the Supreme Court increasingly getting pulled into these major disputes involving congressional maps and election administration. Second, this is important because congressional districts directly impact representation in the House, and these cases naturally carry some major political implications as well going forward. Right now, we are watching multiple states simultaneously collide over these issues in multiple cases now heading to the Supreme Court. And the Virginia case may now become one of the biggest constitutional election fights heading into the 2026 cycle. So that is what's currently happening in both the Alabama and Virginia redistricting disputes and how they're now developing in light of what the Supreme Court said. And now one of the cases going to the Supreme Court again on an emergency basis. Now, one final thing that I want to note that's important to really understand and why these cases likely matter far beyond just the election law issues themselves. The congressional redistricting directly impacts the makeup and control of the House of Representatives, and that ultimately affects everything from federal legislation to committee leadership to oversight of agencies like the ATF and the DOJ. It also impacts, judicial confirmations and constitutional litigation strategies, and really the broader legal landscape surrounding issues like we talk about here, the Second Amendment. So while this case is fundamentally about elections and constitutional procedure, the downstream effects will absolutely impact firearms policies and other constitutional issues that we talk about moving forward. So this is a critical issue that a lot of people are keeping their eyes on because, again, this impacts, what will the congressional makeup really look like going forward. So that's what's going on in these critical election and redistricting lawsuits and challenges. As we get more information, as this unravels more and as the Supreme Court gets more involved, I will update you guys and let you know. If you like this video and you'd like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to like, comment, and subscribe. All of those things help to fuel the algorithm and just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this type of content, and so it shares it with more people. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support, and never forget this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.